Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the Unbreakable Her podcast. I am your host, Monique James. Thank you for being here with us today. Hope that you have been enjoying the episodes so far and all of our guests and stories. Today, it's a little bit of a different episode. We're going to call this Unbreakable Her Story Time. As I have said many times, the purpose of this podcast is really to have a space that celebrates the resilience of women. And that means that sometimes we're going to tap into women from history, or whose some of their resilient deeds um, are historical. And today is one of those times. I felt like it was appropriate because right now in the world, but specifically in the US, there are a lot of things happening that people feel very strongly about, on different sides of the issues that we're faced with. There are plenty of them. And often people are conflicted about how they can potentially stand up for what they believe is right, speak out, what they can do. And so I wanted to highlight someone who made a decision about standing up for what they believed was right. Today, we're going to highlight Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin, she was born and raised in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. And many of us are familiar with Rosa Parks as the face of the catalyst of the Montgomery bus boycott. Most of us, or I won't assume most, but many of us do not know that she was not the first person to refuse to give up her seat to a white person. In fact, Claudette Colvin, 9 months before Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat. And at the time, Claudette was 15 years old. And this will be relevant for several reasons throughout the story. It's a spring day, March 2nd, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama. School lets out, and Claudette, along with some classmates, decide that they are going to, instead of going straight home, they're going to go to kind of like where some shops are in town. And after that, they decide to take the bus home. And so they board the bus. There aren't many people on the bus initially, but then the bus starts to fill up. At that point, a white person boards the bus, and the bus driver yells, or says, "You need to get up." Claudette was with several classmates, as I mentioned, so those classmates did get up and move further to the back, but she did not. And before I continue the story, I think this is generally well understood, but it bears repeating that during this time in the South, we're talking about the mid 50s, Jim Crow was in full effect. So one thing that Claudette was very aware of was the fact that Black people did not have the same kinds of freedom of movement and existence that white people had. So what was really impressed upon her at a very young age, she tells a story about how her mother she was with her mother in a general store, and uh, a little boy who was white said something to her, and wanted to like see her hands or something. And when she showed him her hands, they touched hands, and her mother actually uh, gave a little corporal punishment. And she said she actually knew the boy. It wasn't that they were in close relationship, but she knew who he was because her family and people who her family knew had cleaned houses for that family. So they were acquainted with this little boy. She knew who he was, and she didn't think she was doing anything wrong. But her mother told her later, after they got out of the store, "You do not touch white people." So I think that is a really important story. She said she thinks that she was about 8 or 9 at the time. So very early, she understood this difference. And I think in hindsight, so speaking from a 2026 lens, it's easy to say, it's not appropriate for her mother to make that clear, or to validate or co-sign racism, and segregation. But I will also say it's important to realize that that was a lot of you would find Black parents doing that. We have remnants of it now, and it's really all for it's usually for safety. Um, Knowing that our children will not always have us there to guide them in certain moments, it is important to set the standard for how to interact in certain spaces and certain situations. And so that's what her mother was doing. And so Claudette was very much aware of the differences between how Black people were allowed to move and exist in Montgomery, Alabama, and in the world, and how white people were. So the beginning of March, her and her classmates, is also important to note, we're just coming off of celebrating Black History. Now, we now have February as Black History Month, but at the time, when Black History was first instituted as a holiday or a celebration, it was just a week. And so at the time, her school was a segregated Black school. So they took that week and they said, no, we're going to celebrate all month. And so they were learning about historical liberation figures, and they had also been learning about the Constitution. So just this is the backdrop that we find ourselves in when we're thinking about this story. So Claudette is having this encounter coming off of learning about Black history and the US Constitution and feeling a way about it. She mentions in several interviews that it did not sit well with her. And she felt like she wanted to do something, but she was 15 years old and she didn't know what to do. So that's where we find ourselves. That's the backdrop or the setting of the story that day on March 2nd. So the bus driver tells everybody to get up. Some of her friends do get up and move to the back of the bus, and she does not. And they are yelling at her, telling her that she needs to get up. She needs to go to the back of the bus. And she says, I don't have to do anything. I know the Constitution. I know I have rights. Somebody from the back of the bus who's her friend. So now her friends are like egging her on, but they are not the ones not being seated, or not getting up. They actually got up, but they also had some stuff to say. And one friend yells from the back, she ain't got to do nothing but stay Black and die, which is hilarious to me because who knew that saying was so old? We're talking civil rights era old. Um, I've been hearing that forever. So here we are. She's not going to get up. She has decided she will not be moving. And another interesting part about the story is because her friends did get up, there were open seats for the white woman to sit down. But it would have meant that she was sitting directly across from Claudette. And Claudette said that would have made her feel like she was equal. And the white woman was not having that. So they tell her to move. She says, I will not. They call the police. The police drag her off of the bus, handcuff her, and take her to jail. This 15-year-old gets arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus. Okay, she's 15. That is a really big decision to make in that moment. I mean, 15 years old, and she's just like, nah, I'm not getting up. So, really impressive mind state. And another thing that I found interesting in one of her interviews, one of the interviewers asked her, what was it at 15 that made you stay in your seat? And there were two things she said that stood out to me. One, she said, it was impulsive. She said she did not wake up that morning thinking that she was going to like fight for her rights. But it was in that moment with the backdrop of all she had been learning about Black liberation and civil rights, and Black leaders, human rights leaders, and the US Constitution, which I find really fascinating that the US Constitution was something that she used to settle in her mind what was owed to her as a person in America. Um, so that was the first thing that it was impulsive. She said she didn't plan it. And then the second thing is that she said she felt like her ancestors were holding her down. She said it was Sojourner Truth on one side and Harriet Tubman on the other side, keeping her from giving up her seat. And she chuckled at that, which, uh, of course, they were not. But the sentiment is that learning about them, there's she had learned about and in some ways taken on the spirit of liberation, and she just wasn't going to be moved that day. Hold on. Actually, let's break that. Who decided women were supposed to be easy? Easy to work with, easy to talk to, easy to manage. Because the moment we have boundaries, opinions, or even needs, suddenly we're being labeled difficult. And somewhere along the way, being easy became the most important characteristic of a woman. Now, some things are supposed to be easy. Easy bake oven, according to the internet, losing weight, choosing sweatpants over real clothes. All of those things should be easy. But women are not supposed to be easy at the expense of boundaries. Having boundaries does not make us hard, it makes us healthy. So, yeah, break that. Get yourself some boundaries and don't make being easy your number one priority at the expense of your overall health. We are unbreakable, but some stuff actually does need to be broken. So, of course, she ends up in jail. She references how she still had her school books with her. They yanked her so hard off the bus that her school books went flying. It was a very aggressive removal from the bus. So she goes to jail. And that evening, she said she was thinking to herself, I don't even know if my mother knows what happened. I don't know how I'm going to get out of here. I don't know who's coming for me. And that's a very interesting thing to think about because there were no cell phones or, her friends weren't going to be able to just pick up their cell and call or text her mom or, whoever her guardians were. So she was thinking about like, who's going to find me or how are they going to find me? And that evening, they released her to her mother and her pastor, and they were so proud of her. She wasn't sure how they would react, but they would be me with pride. And I want to make mention of the fact that historically, during the civil rights movement, churches were a really important part of the struggle for civil rights, which is evidenced by the fact that churches were bombed in response to Black people attempting to realize the rights granted to them as citizens of this country. So her pastor was extremely proud. Her mother was extremely proud. That said, interestingly, when she went back to school, she actually endured a lot of scorn. Her classmates mocked her and teased her, and they turned her courage into something laughable, which did not deter her. She mentions that it did not, obviously, it didn't feel good, it wouldn't to anyone, but she was still very much determined. And so she was charged. She had three charges against her, including charges that she attacked a police officer. And then when she had her day in court, she could have very well paid a fine and walked out. Before we get to that, interestingly, the NAACP and other rights organizations and everybody in the community was organizing for her. There were fish fries and all kinds of things to pull together money for her defense. Now, she got a lawyer. They hired an attorney for her. They had her defense prepared. She said her lawyer was ready to go and ready to win. His name was he was a young lawyer named Fred Gray, and she goes before the judge. She said the judge barely looked up and found her guilty on the one charge of um, assaulting an officer. And so the guilty plea or the guilty finding, the verdict, did not mean that she went to jail, but there was an attempt to restrict her. So what what the judge said was, you can go home, but if you have another incident, then you're going to be sent away. So the point wasn't to, they didn't necessarily need to put this 15-year-old girl in jail yet. They just wanted to make sure that she was going to stop her organizing activities or her resistance. So she leaves there. She's discouraged. She's angry. She's worn down. And she's wondering if anybody cares about this. Does it matter to anyone else? She didn't feel any alignment or support from the kids in her school on a broad scale. And many people were saying to her, like, dude, not dude is mine, but this is just how things are. It's just how it is. So don't worry about it. Just go along to get along. But she couldn't. There was something in her that wouldn't let her. And I think it's important to note that very often the people who end up at the forefront of movements or who um, really move the needle on doing transformative things, they're not necessarily doing it because they woke up and decided or woke up and said, let me create this plan, but it's something that they're called to. And I think that's a really important thing to note, because often we want certain celebrities or certain wealthy people or certain, if they have an identity that aligns with the identity of certain oppressed people or people who are being harmed, then the desire is for that person to use their big voice or platform or money to address or combat the issues of harm. And I will say that those things, while they can usually be helpful, I think it's important to let people do what they're called to. And not everybody feels called to liberation efforts. Not everybody feels called to protest in any way. Not everybody feels that they can. And so I think it's important to let people do what they feel like they're called to. So that happens. Claudette goes through the situation, and really there is no movement after that. But 9 months later, there is another bus incident, and that was with Rosa Parks, who is most famously known as the woman who was the catalyst for the Montgomery bus boycotts. So when Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat, it sparked a movement that first it was writing letters and going to the city and going to the bus and saying, hey, this is not right. We want full rights. We should not have to give up our seats. We shouldn't have to sit in the back. All of that. And I'll also note that Claudette said after she had her I ain't getting up moment, that one of the people who stuck with her and stayed in contact with her was Rosa Parks. It's important to note that Rosa Parks was already an adult and she was already fighting for civil rights. This was already part of who she was. And so she got Claudette involved in the youth councils, and she wanted her to stay engaged, even though it felt like she had kind of lost her own fight. But she wanted her to stay engaged, and Claudette makes note of the fact that she stuck with her. So Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat 9 months later. And of course, we know what happens historically. It leads to the bus boycotts. So now Claudette talks about how she said it just felt good to see buses ride by and they would be completely empty. And to know that even though her situation didn't get the recognition for setting everything off, that the fight was happening. They An interviewer asked her, "Oh, um, how do you feel given that you don't really get any historical credit?" She said it was important to her to know that somebody was still fighting, and that somebody, it was all the somebodies, the civil rights leaders and the citizens who were pushing and moving and walking instead of taking the bus. It was a pretty intense situation, but she said as long as somebody was doing it, it was okay. And she said sometimes she would kind of have to fight off feeling a little jealous, but as long as the work was continuing, then she felt good about that. Again, it's important to note that Claudette was 15 years old. She was young. Of course, she would feel a little bit jealous. So, as we know, the bus boycotts happened. But what's very interesting is that even though Claudette was not recognized as a catalyst for those boycotts, she was a key plaintiff in the case that got full rights for Black people on the buses. So what happened was they kept trying to do this through the channels of going to the city, pleading with the bus companies, hey, this isn't right. And it got to the point where they started to look and see, like, actually, this is unconstitutional. And so that gave them an angle to end up at the Supreme Court. And so that's what happened. And Claudette Colvin was a key witness for the plaintiff, and the attorney was her attorney, Fred Gray. So they needed people to tell their stories about how they had these terrible experiences on the bus, because the way the bus company and the city was talking about it was, Black people love being on the buses. Everything's fine. It's all good. What do you mean? And so they needed people to tell the stories, the true stories about the ways that they had been harmed and ways that their experience had not been good. So Claudette Colvin was a key plaintiff in in the case that eventually led to desegregating the buses. That case was Browder versus Gale, and again, she testified, and she talked about her encounter. And two of the three judges in that case ruled in their favor. So that is how segregated seating in Montgomery on the buses became illegal. And then also 6 months after that, they took it to the United States Supreme Court and they won there as well. So it went from segregated seating in Montgomery, Alabama being illegal to segregated seating on all buses in the entire country being illegal. Um, Here's where it gets a little interesting. So I was trying to figure out, you do a little research and find, why is it that Claudette wasn't, you know, why wasn't she the face of this bus movement? And so some people started to put out information that the reason why is because she was 15 years old, she was unwed, and she was pregnant. And so they didn't want her as the face of the movement. So that's only partly true. She actually was not pregnant on March 2nd, 1955, when she refused to give up her seat. She was not pregnant. She became pregnant a few months after her arrest by an older man. And also, she was not from the right side of the tracks. She actually lived in the projects. So there were two things at play, and they both have to do with respectability politics. I'm not making a judgment about that. This is just stated historical fact. Those who were leaders of the movement were trying to be strategic about who they made the front people and the faces of the movement, in order to make sure that they could capture the sympathy and the empathy of the most people. And so having someone who was less refined, not from, you know, uh, the right side of the track, so to speak, was less ideal. And then once she became pregnant, as the boycott stretched and all of that, she also that was also something that played into not wanting to sort of platform her as a person. This happened many times over during the civil rights movement, but it's not specific or unique to the civil rights movement. This happened in movements all over the world since the beginning of time. The leaders were strategic and Rosa Parks fit the bill. And so they were happy to platform her. But again, even though um, Claudette was not the face of the Montgomery bus movement, she did play a role because she testified and told her story during Browder versus Gale. So that's how that went. I think it's really important to think about the fact that sometimes it feels like movements just happen, like liberation figures just emerge. You have a good orator, you have someone who's smart, who is good at getting the masses on their side and helping people to understand. But that's not always it. Or I would say those aren't the only things. These things are strategic. If you look at what's happening in the climate of this country right now, it might seem like people just popped up out of nowhere, but there are documents that tell you this has been in the works for decades. So I don't begrudge the civil rights leaders for their choice because I wasn't there. I don't know how to build a movement, right? I don't begrudge them for their choice. But it does strike me as important to note. I'll say it like that. It strikes me as important to note that the first person to refuse to give up her seat and be arrested for it in Montgomery, Alabama, was a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin. And she said, I've been studying the US Constitution and I know I have rights and I'm not moving. So this was a chance to highlight her story, her strength, and her triumph. If you ride a bus or a train or mode of transportation and you can sit anywhere you like, next to anyone you'd like, you have Claudette Colvin to thank for that. I'll also note here that Claudette Colvin was 15 years old. I don't know a lot of 15-year-olds who would take such a calculated, important, although in her admission, impulsive stance. Um, but maybe it's young people who are going to spark, encourage, and push us toward the change that we need to see within our own country. Don't know. Could be, maybe. Um, but Claudette Colvin died on January 13th, 2026. So just a couple of weeks ago. It felt fitting to take this time to tell her story. I hope that you have found strength in it. I hope that you have taken a moment to appreciate that there are so many more figures in history. We know the names that have been highlighted. We know the names that are in our history books. We know the names that are sometimes just a footnote in our history books, but there are so many more people who were pivotal to movements. Um, Particularly, there are so many women who were huge parts of some of the freedoms, realized freedoms that we have today. And so I hope this story, causes us to remember that even if we don't have the biggest name, or even if we don't have the biggest following, or even if we don't have the biggest push, we can still be impactful right where we are. This has been another episode of the Unbreakable Her podcast. Please be sure to like, share, comment, and engage with the content. Let us know what you thought of the episode, and we'll see you next time. Stay unbreakable.